I want you to close your eyes for just a second. We are going to take a trip down to Hickory, North Carolina.
Oh, wow. Okay. North Carolina.
Yeah. It is 1999. And if you were standing right on the corner of Main Street, you can practically hear the pulse of the town.
Yeah.
It was known everywhere as the furniture capital of the world.
A huge manufacturing hub.
Exactly. And that was not just a clever slogan on a billboard. It was the reality. You lived in Hickory, you made things. Your dad probably ran a lathe turning table legs, or maybe your mom upholstered dining chairs. The air actually smelled like sawdust and lacquer. It was literally the smell of money.
A very distinct, heavy industrial smell. The smell of a booming economy.
Right. And economically, this place was completely bulletproof. Unemployment was effectively zero. The joke was that if you got fired at 9 in the morning, you would have a brand new job by noon right across the street.
Because demand was just that high.
Exactly. But then the calendar turns. We hit the 2000s, and it is not a slow, subtle decline. It is like somebody just flipped a breaker switch.
The silence. That is what really strikes you when you read the first-hand accounts of that era. The big saws stop. The delivery trucks just stop running.
It is chilling. And today we are not just telling a sad story about furniture. We are simulating a war.
But not a kinetic war.
No, not a war of missiles and tanks, but a war of tariffs, of soybeans, of intellectual property, and frankly, of doctrine.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am your host, and today we are plunging into the trade war between the United States and China. We are going to strip away all the political shouting matches you see on cable news and look at the actual mechanics.
Why it started and how it was fought.
Exactly, and according to the hard data, who is actually winning. Now, to help us unpack this incredibly dense topic, I am thrilled to introduce our resident expert, a master's-level professor who specializes in international relations in East Asia. It is great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to get into the weeds on this one. It is such a critical topic for anyone trying to understand modern geopolitics. So to make sure we do this right, and to ensure we are being completely transparent with you, the listener, about where all of this information is coming from, we are building this entire discussion on a very specific stack of required reading.
We have quite the syllabus today.
We really do. We are pulling from How the China Shock Deep and Swift Spurred the Rise of Trump by Bob Davis and John Hilsenrath from the Wall Street Journal. We also have a major critique on More Pain Than Gain, How the United States-China Trade War Hurt America from the Brookings Institution.
And we are also looking at a fascinating review of Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, which was published in the Financial Times.
Plus, we are digging straight into the primary evidence. We have the Section 301 final report and the official hearing transcripts from the Office of the United States Trade Representative.
Those are wild to read, by the way.
Oh, they are incredible. And to check the actual economic score, we are using an economic analysis of the Phase 1 trade deal by Chad Bown from the Peterson Institute for International Economics.
And finally, to look at where we are heading, we have the Understanding the United States-China Decoupling Report by the United States Chamber of Commerce and the current Biden-Harris administration's national security strategy.
So we are going strictly by the book today, folks. Every argument and data point we discuss comes directly from these sources. And as a quick note, there is some politically charged content in these documents, but we are just the messengers here. We are impartially reporting the viewpoints found in the texts.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to understand the doctrine behind economic statecraft. Usually when people talk about this trade war, it instantly devolves into these shallow talking points like tariffs are just a tax on consumers versus we have to protect our hardworking factory workers.
And while those are totally valid arguments, they're very surface level.
Yeah, right. We need to go deeper. We need to understand why the United States, after literally decades of championing open markets and free trade, suddenly decided to just flip the table over.
So let us start right where the conflict really began. Not in a boardroom in Washington, but back in that empty parking lot in Hickory, North Carolina. The Wall Street Journal investigation paints this incredibly vivid and honestly heartbreaking picture of what they call the China shock.
And it is important to clarify that China shock is not just a catchy newspaper headline.
Right, it is a formal term.
Exactly. It is a specific economic term. It describes the period right after China officially joined the World Trade Organization in 2001.
So Hickory was the furniture capital, right? In the late 90s, their unemployment was below 2%. People were literally packing up and moving there from West Virginia and Tennessee just because there was so much steady work. But then China enters the World Trade Organization, and the Wall Street Journal makes this really vital distinction. They say this was not like the competition we saw from Mexico or Japan in the past. This was fundamentally different. Why was it so different?
It was different because of the sheer unprecedented scale and the speed of it. When the Asian tiger economies like Taiwan or South Korea emerged, or when the North American Free Trade Agreement opened up trade borders with Mexico, those were definitely economic shocks. People lost jobs.
Right. The system had to adjust.
But China's emergence as a global trade powerhouse rattled the American economy much more violently than literally anyone anticipated. It was deep and it was incredibly swift. We are talking about hundreds of millions of new workers entering the global labor pool almost overnight.
Wow. And the data point that really just stuck with me from that article was that by 2010, import competition had completely devastated Hickory. Their unemployment skyrocketed to 15%.
15% is depression-level numbers for a local economy.
It really is. The region lost thousands and thousands of well-paying furniture jobs. But here's the part that always confuses me when I think about traditional economics. Standard economic theory. Stuff everyone learns in economics. One says that globalization is supposed to be good overall.
Right, the rising tide lifts all boats theory.
Exactly. The theory says if China starts making cheaper furniture, then yes, the factory in Hickory closes. That is the painful part. But those workers are then freed up to go do something supposedly more productive?
The theory assumes they all just move to Silicon Valley to learn how to code, or they relocate to a big city with a booming high-tech healthcare sector. And ideally, the whole national economy becomes more efficient, and every single consumer in America gets to buy a much cheaper dining room table at the store. It's supposed to be a massive net positive.
But that absolutely did not happen in Hickory.
No, it did not happen at all. And this is the glaring failure of the academic theory that Davis and Hilsenrath highlight in their piece. They call it labor immobility.
Labor immobility. Unpack that for us.
Basically, in the real world, people have deep roots. They have mortgages that are underwater. They have aging parents who need care. They have kids in the local high school. They cannot just magically pick up their entire lives and move to a coastal city where the cost of living might be double or triple what they are used to.
Right, that makes total sense. You are not just moving a spreadsheet number, you are moving a family.
Exactly. So instead of seamlessly moving to these new futuristic jobs, they just stayed put. Many went on disability programs, others just dropped out of the workforce entirely. The labor force in that specific area literally shrank by 25,000 jobs.
25,000 people just gone from the working world. So the smooth adjustment that the economists promised Washington just never arrived in these towns. The town just broke.
It shattered. And this is exactly where the raw economics turns into volatile politics. The Wall Street Journal article explicitly links this massive economic displacement directly to the severe political polarization we are seeing today. They found that the geographic areas hardest hit by Chinese imports, places exactly like Hickory, became the absolute strongest bases of support for Donald Trump.
And when you think about it from their perspective, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
If you are a hardworking person in Hickory and you have watched your entire livelihood and your community vanish over 15 years, and then you hear a candidate standing on a stage saying, quote, "China is raping our country," end quote, which is a direct quote reference in the Wall Street Journal source, that kind of aggressive language really resonates.
Because it validates their lived experience in a way that some politician promising cheaper consumer goods at a big box store simply does not.
It validates their brutal reality. For 20 solid years, Washington politicians from both major parties told them free trade is good for you. It is good for America. And they looked at their empty bank accounts and their boarded up main streets and said, no, it absolutely is not.
That fundamental disconnect is what finally shattered the long-standing political consensus.
And that brings us to the actual intellectual shift. It was not just raw populist anger out in the country. There was a formal doctrine being meticulously formed to support this anger. Let us look at the Financial Times review of Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free. Now, Lighthizer was the United States trade representative under the Trump administration. He was the primary architect of this entire trade war. But he is not just a generic politician, is he?
No, he is a true believer. He has been studying and fighting these trade battles for decades. You could call him the high priest of protectionism. And his book is fascinating to read because it is a complete, unabashed rejection of the economic consensus that basically ruled Washington for 40 years.
And what exactly was that consensus? Let us define that for the listener.
The consensus was unfettered free trade. The overwhelming bipartisan idea that you should always aim to lower tariffs, always strive to open markets, and essentially trust that the free market will efficiently sort everything out. That was the Washington consensus.
Everyone was on board.
Pretty much. The Democrats generally wanted it for diplomatic reasons, to tie nations together so they wouldn't fight. And the Republicans wanted it because it was fantastic for multinational corporate business. But Lighthizer comes in and argues that this entire 40-year period was actually a historical anomaly. A mistake.
Really? An anomaly?
Yes. He points out, looking back at history, that the United States was actually built and industrialized behind a massive wall of protective tariffs. He specifically references Alexander Hamilton's early economic policies to prove this point.
So wait, his grand plan is to basically go back to the economic policies of the 1800s?
In a strategic sense, yes. He argues forcefully that a great nation must actually produce physical things. It cannot just be a nation that consumes things made far away. There's this one line in the Financial Times review that I think sums up his entire worldview perfectly. He heavily critiques the prevailing view that, quote, cheap televisions trump American factories, end quote.
Wow. Cheap televisions trump American factories. That is a really powerful framing device. But, Professor, I play the devil's advocate here for a second.
Please do.
I happen to like cheap televisions. And low prices genuinely help working-class families. If we heavily protect that inefficient furniture factory in North Carolina, do we not indirectly hurt the single mom in Ohio who is just trying to buy affordable school clothes and appliances at a discount store?
And that right there is the absolute classic free trade argument.
Right.
Consumer welfare is considered king. The cheaper the goods, the further a paycheck goes. But Lighthizer entirely flips that logic on its head. She asks a very uncomfortable question. What good is a ridiculously cheap television if you do not have a decent paying job to actually pay for it?
Ah, I see.
He argues that physical production creates strong, stable communities. It creates a local tax base. It builds schools. If you relentlessly outsource all your production to chase the lowest wages, you completely hollow out the middle class. And eventually the entire society becomes politically and socially unstable. He views national production as an end in itself, not just a means to get cheaper stuff.
And there was also a major strategic component to this doctrine, right? It was not just about saving factory jobs. It was fundamentally about what the West thought China was eventually going to become.
Exactly. This is the geopolitical angle.
Yeah.
The big bet that the West made when they formally let China into the World Trade Organization, people often call it the end of history bet. The assumption was that as China got incredibly rich through global trade, a growing middle class would inevitably demand more freedom. They would naturally become more democratic and more market-oriented.
They would become more like us, basically.
That was the hope. But Lighthizer, and frankly all the sources we are looking at today, argue that the exact opposite happened. China absolutely got richer, yes. But it actively maintained strict authoritarian state control. The ruling Communist Party did not slowly fade away into a liberal democracy. They used the massive new wealth to heavily tighten their grip on society.
So the United States basically woke up and realized it had just spent 2 decades blindly funding and building up a massive strategic rival that had zero intention of playing by the established rules of the free market.
Precisely. The bet failed.
Okay, so that perfectly sets the stage for the conflict. You have the very real human cost in devastated places like Hickory, and then you have this major intellectual shift in Washington led by people like Lighthizer who are saying we need to stop blindly worshiping at the altar of free trade.
Right, the mood had completely soured.
So the United States decides it is finally time to fight back. But obviously in international law, you cannot just declare a massive economic war just because you are generally unhappy with how things turned out. You need real legal justification.
Correct. You cannot just act on a whim. You need a formal casus belli. A legal cause for war.
And that brings us directly to segment 2, the indictment. The specific legal weapon the United States chose to wield was something called a Section 301 investigation. Now, I read through this Section 301 final report from the Office of the United States Trade Representative, and I have to say, this massive document literally reads like a mafia criminal indictment. It is just hundreds of pages outlining incredibly specific allegations.
It really does read like a prosecutor's brief. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 is a very specific mechanism. It legally allows the president to take unilateral action against foreign countries that actively violate trade agreements or engage in economic acts that are legally deemed unjustifiable or unreasonable. It is essentially a legal sledgehammer in the diplomatic toolkit.
So what were the actual charges in this indictment? The first really big one that they focus on is forced technology transfer.
Let us really unpack that one, because forced technology transfer sounds a bit dry and abstract. What does that actually mean for an American business trying to operate over there?
Okay, let me try to explain it the way I understood it from the reading. So imagine you are a huge, successful American car company, like, say, General Motors, or maybe a major chemical manufacturer. You desperately want to sell your new products in China. The Chinese consumer market is astronomical. You absolutely have to be there for your shareholders. But the Chinese government steps in and says, sure, you can come in and sell your cars here. But you cannot just buy land and build your own factory. You are legally required to form what they call a joint venture with a local Chinese company.
Yeah, you cannot fly solo. You have to take on a local partner. And very usually that specific partner is a massive state-owned enterprise controlled by the government.
Exactly. And here is the brutal kicker. In order to get the necessary local permits and operating licenses to actually build that factory, you are forced to hand over your proprietary technology. Your secret blueprints, your advanced software, your closely guarded trade secrets. You have to give all of that to this new government-backed partner.
So effectively, it's like telling a world-famous bakery, you can sell your amazing cookies in our town, but only if you give the mayor's cousin your grandmother's top secret recipe first.
That is a completely perfect analogy. And so what inevitably happens once they have the secret recipe?
Well, they patiently learn how to bake the cookies themselves. The report details over and over how after a few years of this joint venture, the Chinese partner quietly dissolves the venture. They launch their own brand new independent company using your advanced technology, which, remember, they acquired for absolutely free.
Oh, man.
And then they ruthlessly undercut your prices globally because they are heavily subsidized by the Chinese state. You essentially spent years training and funding your own permanent replacement.
That is basically a state-sponsored pay-to-play model. And the trade representative report aggressively argues that this is not just tough business negotiation tactics. It is a systematic, top-down government policy designed to deliberately harvest American innovation.
Yes.
And the report also spends a lot of time talking about this overarching plan called Made in China 2025.
This is critical to understand the long-term threat. Made in China 2025 is a comprehensive industrial master plan officially released by Beijing. It openly identifies key high-tech sectors where they want total dominance. Things like advanced robotics, aerospace engineering, cutting-edge electric vehicles, biotechnology.
And their stated goal isn't just to sort of catch up to the West.
No, not at all. Their explicit goal is to completely replace foreign technology with their own indigenous innovation. They want to dominate the entire global supply chain in those future industries.
And they use massive state subsidies to achieve that dominance, don't they?
Absolutely massive subsidies. The report meticulously details how the government literally floods these targeted sectors with endless cash. This bottomless funding allows these Chinese companies to operate at a massive financial loss for years. They deliberately undercut global competitors on price and literally drive them straight into bankruptcy. It creates a severe market distortion where brilliant American companies simply cannot compete, not because their products aren't better, but because they do not have the treasury of an entire nation-state bankrolling their losses.
It's an impossible playing field. Then the indictment moves on to the cyber theft charge. The report details incredibly sophisticated state-sponsored cyber intrusions directly into United States commercial networks.
And let us be crystal clear here for the listener. We're not talking about some bored teenage hackers in a basement defacing a corporate website. The United States government report specifically names active military units like the People's Liberation Army Unit 61398. This is the official military apparatus. Yes, they were actively hacking into United States solar panel companies, major steel manufacturers, and even sensitive nuclear power plant designers. And they were not trying to steal credit card numbers for a quick buck. They were systematically stealing highly classified technical data, vast trade secrets, and crucial internal negotiating positions so their state companies would have the upper hand.
It is literally industrial espionage executed on a massive national scale. And finally, wrapping up the major charges there is the going out strategy. This is where the Chinese government actively directs its massive state-backed firms to go out and legally buy up vulnerable American companies. But they do not buy them because they are great long-term investments. They buy them specifically to acquire their proprietary technology and ship it back home.
Exactly. So when you look at the whole picture, an indictment is incredibly heavy. It meticulously paints a detailed picture of a totally rigged economic game.
But here is exactly where the narrative gets incredibly complicated. The United States Trade Representative actually held extensive public hearings on all these proposed tariffs. And reading through the official China technology transfer hearing transcripts, the American business community was, let's just say, they were heavily conflicted.
Conflicted is definitely putting it mildly. I was reading through these verbatim testimonies, and you can literally feel the palpable tension in the hearing room. You have some major industries like cutting-edge semiconductors or advanced biotechnology that are practically screaming about the intellectual property theft. They are begging the government, saying, please, you have to step in and stop them from stealing our future. We're bleeding out here.
Right. But then sitting right next to them, you have other massive American industries who are absolutely terrified of starting a trade war.
Because they know exactly what will happen to their bottom line.
Exactly. I found this one specific quote in the testimony really telling. A witness formerly noted that United States exports to China currently supported roughly 2.6 million American jobs. Think about that. You have major companies that have literally spent the last 3 decades meticulously building their supply chains in China. You have rural American farmers who currently sell half of their entire yearly harvest directly to Chinese buyers.
And that perfectly encapsulates the terrifying dilemma of modern economic statecraft. If Washington suddenly slaps huge tariffs on Chinese goods to forcefully punish them for stealing advanced technology, China's absolutely going to hit back. They have to save face. And who do they hit? They hit the vulnerable farmers in the Midwest. They hit the major exporters. Those 2.6 million stable jobs are suddenly sitting right in the crosshairs.
It is essentially like holding a live grenade and aggressively threatening to pull the pin, but you are also locked inside a small room with the guy you are threatening.
That is a terrifyingly perfect description of the situation. It is mutually assured economic destruction. And despite knowing that massive risk, the Trump administration looked at the long-term technological threat and consciously decided to pull the pin anyway.
Which forcefully drags us right into segment 3, the war itself.
And the escalation, once it started, was incredibly fast. We can track this exact blow by blow using the detailed timeline provided by the Peterson Institute for International Economics.
So the timeline starts in July of 2018.
Right. The United States officially fires the first major shot. They impose strict 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. These targeted goods were mostly heavy industrial machinery and vital intermediate manufacturing parts.
And what was Beijing's reaction to that opening salvo?
Immediate, literally within hours. They executed a precise dollar-for-dollar retaliation. They instantly imposed their own 25% tariffs on exactly $34 billion of United States goods. But they did not just pick random items out of a hat. They were incredibly strategic and surgical. They deliberately looked at the United States electoral map.
They intentionally targeted the specific voters who elected the president.
Exactly. They aimed straight at the political base of the administration, which brings us directly to the tragic collateral damage of this war. We really need to talk about the American farmers, because reading the trade representative hearing transcripts regarding the agriculture sector is just absolutely brutal.
I was reading the section specifically focused on soybeans. This is an absolutely massive industry for the heartland. Before the war, China was comfortably the single largest importer of United States soybeans in the entire world. They bought $14 billion worth every single year. $14 billion. That is a gigantic chunk of the total American agricultural harvest.
And basically overnight, that vital $14 billion market effectively vanished into thin air.
Yeah.
When China strategically slapped that 25% retaliatory tariff on United States soybeans, the global price just completely plummeted.
There was heartbreaking testimony from multi-generational farmers saying they had spent 30 solid years painstakingly building up that foreign market. They literally flew over there. They shook hands with officials. They hosted seminars to teach Chinese buyers about the superior protein content of American soy. They built deep personal relationships. And then suddenly, when the tariffs hit, the Chinese buyers just completely stopped returning their calls.
Just absolute silence. And this highlights a massive long-term strategic consequence that the Brookings Institution article emphasizes. Global trade is not a simple light switch. You cannot just casually turn it off when you are mad and turn it right back on a year later. When China abruptly stopped buying American soy, they obviously did not stop eating. They still needed food.
Right, so they just started buying their soybeans from Brazil and Argentina instead.
Exactly. They permanently shifted the global supply chain. And the terrifying thing is that once those massive logistical supply chains shift, they do not just easily snap back to normal. If you actively teach Brazilian farmers to plant millions more acres of soybeans and you heavily incentivize their government to build brand new deep-water ports and modern highways to handle that massive new volume, you have essentially created a massive permanent competitor.
That is the hidden long-term cost. Even if the two governments shake hands and the tariffs completely go away tomorrow, those massive new Brazilian farms and shipping ports are still sitting right there actively taking American market share.
Exactly. The damage is permanently locked in.
But it was not just the farmers getting crushed, though. The American Chemistry Council offered some really fascinating testimony, too. This part was super interesting because it shows just how incredibly interconnected the modern global economy truly is. They pointed out that the new tariffs on imported Chinese chemicals were actually severely disrupting critical domestic supply chains for basic water purification systems and vital healthcare products right here in the United States.
And that beautifully illustrates the intermediate goods problem. In the modern economy, we might import a specialized bulk chemical from China, let us say a specific type of activated carbon, and then an American factory uses that carbon to manufacture a high-tech water filter in Ohio. If the government suddenly puts a huge 25% tax on that imported raw carbon, you instantly make the finished American water filter significantly more expensive to produce.
So the local factory owner in Ohio is trapped. They either have to drastically raise their retail prices, hurting American families, or they simply go out of business because they suddenly cannot compete with a European filter company that does not have to pay that massive carbon tax.
Precisely. We are effectively levying heavy taxes on our own domestic manufacturers, just to symbolically punish China. That is the classic self-inflicted wound argument that critics of the trade war constantly bring up.
So the economic war just continues to violently spiral out of control. By late 2019, the United States had aggressively slapped heavy tariffs on over $550 billion of Chinese goods, which is effectively almost every single thing we buy from them. And China had retaliatory tariffs on $185 billion of United States goods. This is when the dramatic term decoupling really started getting thrown around in Washington and the media.
Decoupling, the radical theoretical idea of completely and permanently separating the two largest economies on Earth. It is literally like trying to forcibly unzip a rusty zipper that has been tightly meshed together for 40 solid years.
But then the United States Chamber of Commerce released a major policy report called Understanding the United States-China Decoupling. And they basically stepped in and said, hold on a minute, everybody calm down. Let us objectively look at the actual catastrophic price tag of doing this.
They essentially sounded a massive alarm for the business community. They sternly warned against attempting a full decoupling. They meticulously analyzed the projected economic cost of completely severing all ties, stopping all bilateral trade, blocking all foreign investment, completely halting all cross-border technology flow. And their ultimate conclusion was that a total split would be absolutely disastrous for long-term American global competitiveness.
And why is that? Just because we would permanently lose access to the single biggest consumer market in the world?
That is definitely a huge part of it, yes. But more importantly, we would lose crucial access to the cutting edge of global innovation. If major United States tech companies are completely locked out of China, they are simply not seeing the newest rapid advancements in electric vehicles or next-generation mobile payment systems firsthand. They gradually become globally isolated and technologically stagnant. So to prevent this, the Chamber of Commerce heavily advocated for what they called a balanced approach.
A balanced approach. What exactly does that mean in practical terms?
They argued forcefully for protecting true national security. So absolutely lock down the highly sensitive tech, the specialized military components, the incredibly advanced artificial intelligence chips, build a fortress around that stuff. But they argued we must keep the massive general consumer markets totally open for everything else. If we were just selling athletic sneakers or roasted coffee beans or basic plastic toys, there was absolutely zero national security risk involved. So let that harmless trade keep flowing smoothly to support the economy.
Okay, so the policy shorthand is essentially build really high fences to protect the dangerous stuff, but keep a really big open yard for all the normal, everyday commerce.
Exactly. High fences around a small yard.
Hmm.
But the major problem was that in the chaotic heat of the escalating trade war, that kind of careful nuance was completely getting lost. Both aggressive sides were just blindly swinging sledgehammers at each other's economies. The economic pain was rapidly mounting for everyday citizens on both sides of the Pacific Ocean.
Which perfectly sets up segment 4. The pressure was building, and eventually the sheer economic pain just became way too much to bear. Both governments desperately needed to find a graceful off-ramp to stop the bleeding. And this brings us to the famous Phase 1 trade deal. This highly publicized agreement was officially signed in January of 2020. I vividly remember the breathless headlines. The president at the time literally called it, quote, the biggest deal ever seen, end quote.
Yes, it was very heavily marketed to the public as a massive historical victory, a permanent economic ceasefire.
And the absolute core of this massive deal was a very specific purchasing agreement. China officially committed in writing to buy an additional $200 billion in United States goods and services over the next 2 years. And that is $200 billion above the baseline amounts they were already buying back in 2017.
Right. Let us firmly pause on the actual underlying mechanism here, because it is fundamentally important to understanding why it failed. This entire agreement was an exercise in managed trade.
Managed trade instead of free trade.
Exactly. Instead of actually systematically lowering complex tariff barriers, reforming regulations, and just letting the free market organically decide who buys what based on price and quality, the United States government basically issued a direct political order. They told the Chinese government, you must legally mandate your companies to buy exactly this much American corn, this much natural gas, and exactly this many commercial airplanes.
Wow. When you phrase it like that, it frankly sounds a lot more like a rigid Soviet 5-year plan than a proud capitalist free market agreement.
It is deeply, deeply ironic, isn't it? The United States was furiously trying to fight the inherent unfairness of a state-controlled economy by explicitly utilizing the exact same heavy-handed state-controlled tactics.
Wow. So we have the ultimate historical scorecard right here from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Chad Bound's exhaustive data analysis of this deal is absolutely ruthless. So, Professor, did they actually buy the stuff they promised to buy?
No.
Oh. Well, that is a very short answer.
It really is the only completely accurate answer the hard data supports. They absolutely missed the legal purchasing targets by a truly massive margin. Out of the promised additional $200 billion, China essentially bought none of it.
Wait a second, none of the extra amount. Did they at least manage to maintain the original baseline purchases?
Actually, no, they did not. They did not even manage to reach the original 2017 baseline levels. In fact, according to the specific data, they actually bought significantly less of the crucial manufactured goods covered by the deal than they were buying before the entire trade war even started.
That is wild. But why? I mean, obviously, the global COVID-19 pandemic happened literally right after this deal was signed in early 2020. That massive disruption absolutely had to play a huge role in missing those numbers.
Right. COVID definitely played a major role. Absolutely. The entire global shipping economy essentially froze solid for months. But Bound's detailed data analysis clearly shows that the Chinese purchasing trends were severely off track even before the pandemic officially hit. The trajectory was already failing.
So it was doomed from the start.
Basically, yes. And there is another massive psychological factor at play here. The brutal trade war itself had fundamentally broken the deep-seated trust in those long-standing business relationships. You simply cannot just wave a magic wand and command a private Chinese company to suddenly buy incredibly expensive American industrial machinery if they've already successfully switched over to a highly reliable German supplier or a Japanese supplier during the 2 years of chaotic tariff fights. The foundational business trust was just completely gone.
So the, quote, biggest deal ever seen, end quote, was basically just a colossal bust.
In terms of hitting the explicit contractual purchasing targets, yes, it was a total and complete failure. And the fierce critique from the Brookings Institution goes even further than just the bad purchasing data. Their major article, More Pain Than Gain, forcefully argues that the entire strategic approach of the war was completely flawed from the very first day.
They prominently mention a specific economic study by Moody's regarding the final jobs impact, right?
Yes, they do. The comprehensive Moody's study they cite estimated that the sheer chaos and increased costs of the trade war actually ended up costing the overall United States economy nearly 300,000 jobs.
Wait, 300,000 net jobs lost. But the entire stated political point of launching the trade war was to proudly save American manufacturing jobs. How on earth do you accidentally lose 300,000 jobs while you're actively trying to save them?
And that right there is the fundamental tragedy of broad protectionism. You absolutely might successfully save 1,000 vulnerable jobs in a specific Ohio steel mill by throwing heavy protective tariffs on cheap imported steel. The steelworkers definitely benefit. But then you artificially raise the fundamental raw cost of steel for Ford Motor Company and for Caterpillar Tractor Company and, frankly, for every single small construction business across America.
I see the ripple effect.
Exactly. Because their essential raw materials are now significantly more expensive, those huge companies suddenly become much less competitive on the global stage. They sell fewer cars and tractors internationally, and eventually they're forced to lay off thousands of American workers to cut costs. The terrible economic losses are quietly spread out across the entire economy, so you do not see them in one single factory closing, but they reliably add up to be vastly larger than the small localized gains.
Wow, that is deeply frustrating. And the Brookings article also strongly points out that the Phase 1 deal completely failed to even attempt to solve the original core structural issues that started the fight in the first place. It entirely focused on these shallow managed purchase targets, buy more of our Midwestern soybeans, but it did absolutely nothing to seriously legally address the blatant forced technology transfers or the massive illegal state subsidies.
That is exactly right. We intentionally burned through all of this massive economic leverage. We knowingly suffered all of this widespread domestic economic pain just to finally extract a hollow written promise to buy physical goods that they ultimately never even bought. Meanwhile, the truly dangerous structural problems of the massive unfair state subsidies outlined in the Made in China 2025 plan, the relentless military-industrial intellectual property theft, all of those existential threats remained largely untouched and perfectly intact.
So that incredibly frustrating reality finally brings us to the present day. Segment 5, the current doctrine. So we recently had a massive political shift in Washington. We have a brand new administration. President Biden and Vice President Harris come into power. Now, logically, you might naturally think, given all the incredibly fierce Democratic criticism of the messy trade war, the massive reported job losses, the total failure of the Phase 1 purchase agreement, that this new administration would immediately tear up all those controversial tariffs on day one and just happily go right back to the old comfortable era of open free trade.
You would absolutely think that based on the campaign rhetoric, but they absolutely did not do that.
Why not? Why keep a failing policy in place?
This is exactly where we have to carefully look at the official Biden-Harris administration's national security strategy document. When you actually read it, it clearly represents a distinct evolution of the aggressive trade doctrine, not a reversal back to the 90s.
So wait, the massive Trump-era tariffs are basically all still sitting right there?
The vast majority of them, yes, they are still actively in place right now. But the fundamental underlying logic used to justify them has significantly shifted. The previous administration's approach was highly transactional. The vibe was basically, I am going to cause you maximum economic pain until you finally agree to sign a paper giving me a slightly better financial deal. The new Biden administration approach is much more structural and deeply long-term. The new strategy focuses significantly less on merely balancing the monthly trade deficit numbers and focuses heavily on a new core concept they call outcompeting.
Outcompeting. Okay, what does outcompeting actually look like in practical everyday policy?
In practical terms, it means a massive return to aggressive domestic industrial policy, seriously investing huge sums of money directly at home. If you carefully read through the official strategy document, it talks endlessly about desperately rebuilding crumbling American physical infrastructure and deliberately investing massive billions of federal dollars directly into cutting-edge domestic semiconductor chip manufacturing and advanced scientific research. It is essentially a blunt admission that we simply cannot just bully a massive nation like China into completely changing their core economic model. The only real solution is that we actually have to proactively run faster and invent better technology ourselves.
That makes a lot of sense. Build up your own muscles instead of just trying to constantly sweep the leg of your opponent. But, the actual formal document also uses some remarkably strong, surprisingly combative language about China. I was genuinely surprised by how incredibly direct and blunt it was.
Oh, it is incredibly direct. It pulls absolutely no punches. The document explicitly and formally states, that the People's Republic of China actively violates the established baseline rules of international trade. It bluntly says that the old global rules were actively designed to heavily privilege corporate mobility and corporate profits over the well-being of everyday American workers.
Honestly, that sounds exactly like a fiery quote Lighthizer would have put in his own book. It is a very America First sentiment coming directly from a historically free, trade-leaning Democratic administration.
It absolutely is.
So the grand 40-year free trade consensus really has been completely permanently broken then. Both major political parties apparently now completely agree that the glorious old free trade era of the 90s was fundamentally flawed and frankly kind of naive.
Yes, that era is completely officially dead. But there is a very key strategic difference in how the two different administrations chose to handle the exact same problem. The previous administration was aggressively unilateral. Their entire philosophy was essentially America aggressively fighting against everyone else. They routinely slapped massive steel and aluminum tariffs on our closest historical allies too, like Canada and the European Union, just to prove a point. The current administration's strategy firmly emphasizes actively rallying our international partners.
Ah, I see. Creating a quote-unquote level playing field across the whole globe.
Exactly. Actively working hand in hand with the European Union, actively coordinating with Japan and South Korea to collectively apply massive united economic pressure on Beijing. And frankly, the new focus is much, much tighter on strict technology security rather than just generalized trade deficits. This goes directly back to that specific Chamber of Commerce idea we discussed earlier, the high fence, small yard concept. The current administration's strategy heavily highlights the urgent absolute need to flawlessly protect what they term the frontiers of the modern economy.
And by frontiers, they mean things like fully secure digital trade, advanced artificial intelligence development, and the absolute latest generation of quantum computing chips.
Precisely.
So we are not really wasting our time frantically trying to stop the simple trading of cheap plastic toys or Midwestern soybeans anymore.
No, not at all. We are desperately trying to permanently stop the open trading of the highly advanced foundational technology that will utterly define global military and economic supremacy for the next entire century.
Yeah.
We are fundamentally saying to the world, you can absolutely still buy all of our corn and our natural gas, but you absolutely cannot, under any circumstances, have our incredibly advanced semiconductor blueprints. It is a highly targeted, security-based technological decoupling rather than a chaotic total economic divorce.
Okay, let us try to concisely synthesize all of this massive information because we have covered an incredible amount of heavy historical ground today. We started our journey standing in a hollowed-out, completely silent furniture factory down in Hickory, North Carolina. We vividly watched the entire United States slowly and painfully wake up to the devastating reality of the China shock. We carefully examined the massive intellectual pivot to a highly confrontational protective doctrine heavily championed by Lighthizer. We watched the messy, chaotic trade war rapidly escalate, aggressively hurting innocent farmers and domestic manufacturers in the crossfire. We analyzed a highly touted Phase 1 deal that completely and utterly failed to deliver on its massive promise numbers. And finally, right now, we find ourselves navigating this intense, brand new era of permanent strategic global competition, where the phrase free trade is essentially treated as a dirty, naive word in Washington.
That is the complete historical arc, yes. We have slowly and painfully moved away from the naive optimism of the 1990s, the so-called end of history era, where we arrogantly just assumed that everyone would eventually become a peaceful liberal democracy as long as they got rich enough. And we have fully entered a brand new, highly volatile era of aggressive great power competition that is literally being fought every single day on massive cargo container ships and in the global stock markets.
It honestly just feels like we are living in a completely fundamentally different world than we were just 10 or 15 short years ago. The boundless economic optimism of the late 90s is just completely gone.
It is entirely gone. The paradigm has permanently shifted.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think there's one final, highly provocative thought that we absolutely need to leave the listener with today to chew on.
Oh, absolutely. Go for it.
If you look closely at the hard objective data from the actual rigorous studies, the Peterson Institute data, the Brookings Institution analysis, the blunt truth is that the trade war fundamentally failed in almost all of its explicitly stated economic goals. It did not significantly reduce the massive overall trade deficit. It absolutely did not magically bring all the heavy manufacturing jobs straight back to places like Hickory in the short term. It provably raised everyday prices for struggling American consumers. By almost every single standard traditional economic metric you can use, it was a massive, costly failure.
Okay, that seems incredibly clear from everything we just discussed.
However, And this is the absolutely massive, however, that historians will write about as successfully and permanently shattered the complacent political consensus on endlessly engaging with China. It aggressively, violently woke the entire sleeping country up to the massive existential strategic risk we were taking. It finally forced lazy corporate boardrooms to actually start seriously thinking about what they call a China plus one strategy.
Meaning proactively moving their critical backup factories to safer places like Vietnam or India or Mexico, just in case things go wrong.
Exactly right. Building vital redundancy. It permanently highlighted the sheer terrifying danger of blindly relying on a massive strategic global rival for our basic life-saving medical supplies, our antibiotics, and our most critical military technology.
So you were basically arguing that it was arguably a massive long-term strategic success, even if it was a catastrophic short-term economic failure.
Perhaps yes. The history books are still being written. But the truly difficult, lingering question for you, the listener, right now is this. The golden, carefree era of incredibly cheap, globally sourced consumer goods appears to be permanently over. We are rapidly moving toward a vastly more complex world of highly redundant, expensive supply chains, a world of friend shoring our factories to allied nations, and a world heavily burdened by permanent national security tariffs. This new world is absolutely going to cost a lot of money to build and maintain. It will definitively mean noticeably higher retail prices at Walmart and significantly higher operating costs for small businesses. We are quite literally trading our historical economic efficiency for our future national security.
That is the ultimate brutal trade-off, isn't it?
It is. So the question is, are we as a democratic society genuinely willing to permanently pay that massive financial price? Are we collectively willing to quietly accept lower personal economic efficiency and higher daily inflation permanently in direct exchange for guaranteed national security and total vital supply chain independence from a massive rival superpower? Because sooner or later, that massive historic bill is coming due.
Wow, that is an incredibly heavy, vitally important question to end on. Is the guaranteed future security truly worth the permanent daily inflation? Professor, thank you so much for expertly guiding us through all these incredibly dense historical documents today.
It's always an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
And a huge thank you to you, the listener, for joining us on this incredibly detailed deep dive. If you want to actually read these fascinating reports entirely for yourself, the original Bob Davis article, the full massive Section 301 legal report, all that granular Peterson Institute later, we will definitely have the full comprehensive list linked right down in the show notes. We honestly barely even scratched the absolute surface of the massive Made in China 2025 planning document today, so I highly aggressively recommend you go click that link and read it for yourself. It is eye-opening. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep digging into the primary source material, and we will see you right back here on the very next deep dive.